Welcome back to the first episode of Miller's Movers post Cheltenham. Thought this week we'd have a quick dash through the highlights, any eye catchers from the Cheltenham Festival. There's been loads of content over the last month or so I think a shorter podcast is the order of the day. So we'll start with the Tuesday, the Supreme. I think this saw a really good performance by Kopek de Board. Travelled really strongly through the race. He jumps quite big. Certainly looks like he's got the scope to go chasing if they choose. And I think you have to factor in that having lost his hind legs or landing on his hind legs after the last, he again quickened up the hill as he had done at Leopardstown when hampered. This is clearly a horse with a massive engine and a massive future. The same would apply to William Money. I think he'll almost certainly go chasing. Romeo Coolio, I don't think he's quite as quick as they hoped he would be. He needs to go up in trip. And of the eye catcher, I wouldn't give up on Work Ahead. He was far too free through this and pulled himself into tiredness at the top of the hill. And Tusi Quanti, I think he's interesting. He's only gone up to a mark of 128, just up 3 pounds for that. He was outclassed in this throughout, certainly outpaced, but he stayed on quite nicely in the closer stages past tired horses. And I think there's a handicap in him before the end of the season. He might even be a Great Wood hurdle horse for next season. Onto the Arkle, well, this was the most bizarre race. It set the tone for the week, really. Management didn't jump with any fluency. He bulldozed a second last. I think you can put the jumping down to the livelier ground here, and I don't think he was perhaps given the most aggressive ride by Mark Walsh. I think a more aggressive ride might have helped his jumping out. Only by night, she looked like she came there to win it. She was given a really good stalking ride by Keith Donoghue, but she didn't perhaps have the class to see it through. And Loda Sud, he faded into fourth. He maybe got stuck in front a little bit too long, having taken it up when Management bulldozed the second last. That meant Django Bay, who'd given a really patient ride by Nico de Bourville when he was unable to go the pace. He elected not to push and scrub and try and hang on to their coattails, filled him up, came one run, and did produce the fastest finishing furlong of a 2-mile chase of the week. But it's not a form line I'm going to get terribly carried away with. I think Management is clearly the best horse that lined up here. Probably needs a little bit softer ground and arguably a little bit further. The Ultima saw a really good performance by Miretown under Patrick Wadger, really finely judged ride. Good aggression shown, but he timed it to perfection because I think there'd have been a good number of jockeys stalking him into the home straight that fancied their chances, but he kept enough in reserve and actually cleared right away after the last. I think people have got a bit carried away, though, with this performance. He was racing off a mark just 127, 10 stone through on his back. He was very lightly weighted. He's up 15 pounds now to a mark of 142. And while I'm sure natural development will see him eventually defy that handicap mark, I think people have perhaps got a bit carried away with the level of performance. Melina Girl was interesting. She got outpaced down the hill. She stayed on well in the closing stages. I certainly think she's got a handicap over a little bit further in her, as has the Short Go. He didn't really jump with any fluency, but he rallied to good effect. I think there's a staying handicap in him, 3 mile 4, maybe a little bit further. And Famous Bridge might be interesting if going towards the Scottish National. He got dropped a pound here down to a mark of 141. He didn't appear to appreciate the livelier ground over the trip this short. He was fourth last year, but he didn't manage to match that this time. But I think going up in trip, even on livelier ground, might well see him to better effect. The Mares' Hurdle doesn't need much saying about it. Lossiemouth showed a tremendous constitution, though, to bounce back from that heavy fall at Leopardstown. But as soon as she was going to take her chance, it was simply a case of whether she'd be able to deliver her performance after that fall. She did. She clearly loves this track. She's a cut above these. I don't see any reason why she wouldn't come back for this next year. I think it's been proven that she hasn't got the speed to match the geldings in the Champion Hurdle, and she can win plenty of Mares' Hurdles going forward from here. We then went on to the Champion Hurdle, and this was a bizarre race. Constitution Hill coming down, having taken a bit of a liberty at the fourth. He tried to do the same at the fifth and paid the price, though I do think he was a little unfortunate to catch the hurdle as it was travelling back after Brighter Days Ahead had given it a flick. But he's going to have to get his act together now with his jumping. So often you can find a horse that makes a mistake and ends up on the floor. If they've not had any physical issue, it does tend to sharpen their thinking, and I expect him to be far more agile and measured with his hurdling next time, which looks like being Punchestown. So hopefully he goes there and we get a good race there. I've seen people say that State Man put in an improved performance in cheek pieces. I don't really buy that. He was just 5 lengths ahead of Golden Ace going down to the last. And whilst Golden Ace is now a Champion Hurdle winner, I think we all know where her level's at. I don't think State Man improved much from last year, in truth. Golden Ace left to pick up the pieces. It was a good story because they were able to reap the benefit of being brave, putting her into the championship race, and they got their date. Jeremy Scott, a very likeable trainer. Lorcan Williams had a tough season serving that whip ban. So it was a pretty good, feel-good story, even if it wasn't the result that we were all hoping and expecting. And then on to the National Hunt chase. the last race that really caught my eye, Haiti Couleurs. I was impressed with him. He was a fairly confident nap on the day. I was slightly concerned when Ben Jones took over in the saddle. I'm just not sure he's quite as composed as Sean Byrne, but he did a really good job. Used the horses jumping, took up the running when it suited him and stayed on powerfully to the line. Of those in behind, I thought Resplendent Grey really ran a big race. He was tailed off at the top of the hill, but under a strong Sean Bowen drive, he rallied to good effect. He got dropped a pound down to a mark of 141. He would be interesting if going for something like the Scottish National, maybe even the Irish National, provided Ollie Murphy can keep his good form going. He's been in good form for all of the season. At some point, his form is bound to tail off. Transmission, I think, was given far too much to do by Patrick Mullins, was too far back in a race where the winner came from a prominent position. But he's been dropped a pound down to a mark of 132 and wouldn't be given up on him yet. He'll stay further, and he arguably wants a little bit softer ground. Of the novice hurdles, I think it's the turners that's going to provide the most strength and depth going forward. This was a really good performance by the New Line under a composed ride by Harry Skelton. He stalked them into the home straight, stayed on the rail as long as he wanted, switched out wide and showed a really good burst of speed to get to the front, but then had to show tenacity and grit to hold off the Yellow Clay, who showed far more speed than I was expecting. I still do wish he'd gone to the Albert Bartlett, but he ran really well, finished second here. Final Demand, we mentioned in the preview pod, he's a big, strong, heavy-topped horse, and he probably wasn't going to be suited by the drying ground coming down the hill. I think that bore itself out. He just didn't quite have the pace, but he remains a very promising prospect. Certainly looks like a 3-mile chaser in the making, and the first 3 really are horses to follow going forwards. Of the eye catching behind, I thought 40 Coates ran really well. He came from a very long way back. He's still a maiden. Henry de Bromhead does very well with his horses when they go chasing. I certainly think this is a horse we'll be hearing plenty more of. Potter's Charm, well, I think they've made a bit of a dog's dinner of his campaign in the second half of the season. They tried to go to Cheltenham and pick up what they thought was a cheap grade 2. They got beaten by 6 Mile Bridge, and I think Potter's Charm had a very tough race on that occasion, and I don't think he's managed to bounce back from that. 6 Mile Bridge, well, he again failed to give his running, but plenty of Fergal O'Brien's did this week. He also had a number of withdrawals with a rash and a temperature. Does suggest that perhaps the health of the yard is not all that. So 6 Mile Bridge would get a pass from me. I think he's certainly better than he showed here, and not a horse to give up on just yet. In the Browns, I think this is a very disappointing Grade 1 novice chase contest. I think they're handicappers in the making. Ballyburn is the big disappointment, and they're going to have to go back to the drawing board with him because he clearly objected to being asked to settle in behind horses and not given an aggressive ride. That compromised his jumping, particularly at the top of the hill over that big open ditch. Paul Townend had to have him on a loose rein trying to not fight him. That meant there wasn't enough positive tension in the horse's frame, and he didn't have enough power to clear that ditch, landed on top of it, and it was curtains over from there on in. Whether they're going to improve his jumping enough and perhaps bring him back in trip and look to go towards the Ryanair, something like that, I don't know. Or whether they'll look to abandon chasing completely and go to the stayers hurdle. But even for that, he's going to have to learn to settle. He cannot go through races like this and expect to stay 3 miles. So he was the disappointment of the week for me. Of the runners in the Browns, Cade de Bourbon, he fell or unseated Patrick Mullins 4 out. It was a pretty soft unseat, truth be told, but he was yet to play his hand, and this is a pretty promising horse. They hoped he would make up into a Grade 1 horse. He's yet to do that, but of the Browns, I think he'd be the horse I'd take most interesting going forwards. The Coral Cup, Jimmy Desoy won this in very impressive fashion indeed. He had graded form from last season behind Ballyburn, and he certainly looked like a graded horse in a handicap here. The Stayers Hurdlers we'll get to looks an open division. He certainly stayed this 2 mile 5 trip well enough, so there's every chance you'll get 3 miles. He's lightly raced. He could well make up into a Stayers Hurdle contender for next year. Comfort Zone was very disappointing, but he jumped poorly, and a number of Joseph O'Brien's didn't run all that well throughout the week. He's just 3 winners from his last 24. Suggests there's maybe a little bit of an issue with the form, and I think 1 or 2 of his didn't give their running. Certainly wouldn't want to give up on Comfort Zone just yet. And Beckett Rock, he caught the eye as well for Henry de Bromhead. Lightly raced as a handicapper. He was caught on heels turning, and he had to wait for his run. Finished very strongly into 6th. I certainly think he's a horse we'll be hearing more about potentially over fences next season. The cross-country chase, we won't waste too much time on. I think this was a bit of a farce of a contest, truth be told. 2 false starts. One loop on the track was far softer than the good to soft that was advertised, and that undoubtedly played a hand in the result, because a number of horses that had been well touted before the race on the idea that they were going to race on good to soft ground were clearly disadvantaged by the soft ground, possibly including the winner, Stumptown. But the one I'd take from this is Vanillier. He was Unfortunately, misdirected by Sean Flanagan fairly early on. The idea was clearly to jump out and be handy. It meant he got knocked back to nearer last than first, had to do quite a lot of work to get into contention, and finished to really good effect. And we'll perhaps get onto him when we talk about the Grand National scratchings later on. The champion chase, I think, again, this is an average contest. Marine National was a great result when thinking to the late Michael O'Sullivan. But the fact that Calixios was still close to him going down to the last, I think Marine National looked the most likely winner. But Calixios, we clearly know his limitations. He's a mid-150s, low 160s horse. I don't think this is a vintage renewal. John Bond, well, he was disadvantaged by the standing start. Apparently, the tape flicked up and startled him slightly. He forfeited a bit of ground, and then he made a mistake going down the back, landed on top of the fence, and that paid to his effort. But the fact he was able to rally and finish second, I think, explains what a weak field this was, but also that he's clearly a horse of tremendous talent. I call it stubbornness, but I still don't believe that this performance shows that Cheltenham is simply not his track. He's currently available at 10 to 1 for next year's champion chase. I think there's far worse investments than that when you consider that Marine National is ahead of him in the market. Mashborough is ahead of him in the market. Well, I can't see any scenario where Mashborough is a champion chase horse next year. And Sergino is the big danger, but he's got to prove that he can get back to racing fitness and retain all his ability after that infected injury. So the champion chase, probably the least exciting Grade 1 chase of the week. The Grand Annual, again, another great story with the win of Jazzy Matty. My selection, Jasco to Dam, I think ran really well in fifth. Had to be snatched up on the bend, just got caught a little bit on heels. That lost a little bit of momentum and then made a slow jump at 2 out, finished to really good effect. This was his first handicap start, fairly lightly raced horse for Henry de Bromhead. Did race off a lightweight here at 10 stone 3, so I'm not getting too carried away, but I do think there's potentially a decent handicap in this horse going forwards. And then the bumper, just 2 eye catches from this, really, for me. Idaho Sun really caught my eye in the paddock beforehand. Big, strong, strapping looking horse. Got terribly outpaced down the hill, but finished to really good effect into 6th. But I think probably the best horse in the race here was Al Cairo, finishing in 5th under David Maxwell. Didn't get a flick of the stick. David Maxwell got a little bit hampered after the last, got bumped around a bit. That compromised his balance. I don't think he was able to push the horse out to full effect. And we know with David Maxwell that he's not up to the standard professional jockey. Personally, I don't have an issue with that. I think he's a great benefit to the sport. But in my opinion, Al Cairo was probably not far off the best horse in the bumper, and certainly one to watch going forward. The Mares Novice Hurdle is not a race I'm going to get excited about. There was plenty of horses coming in here lacking plenty of experience, and I think to varying degrees you'll see plenty of them step forward for this experience. But it was won by Air of Entitlement. She outstayed 6.5, who probably got to the front a little bit soon. Had a good look around. Air of Entitlement had something to run at up the hill, and Julie outstayed her. I think they'll go different directions. I think Air of Entitlement's got every realistic chance of stepping up when she steps up in trip. So the Mares Hurdle next year would look a likely target. Whilst I think 6.5 probably doesn't want to go any further than this 2-mile trip, and might well be one for the handicaps next year. She's a really strong traveller, went through the race very nicely indeed. Something like the County next year, long term, would certainly look realistic for her. But it's not a race that I'm going to take a huge amount of value of the form here, because I think they'll improve at different rates going forward. The Jack Richardson, well, this was probably training performance of the week, with Paul Nicholls winning with Caldwell Potter. He's been pretty disappointing from since the start of the season, being bought out of Gordon Ellis Yard for all that money, but he jumped brilliantly here under Harry Cobden. A good front running ride, coped with the livelier ground. I thought that would go against him. They said they've done a lot of work on his feet, and that's clearly been to his benefit. It looks like he's going to step up in trip now, go to the Grade 1 3-mile at Aintree. Be interested to see what they can do there. Pretty short turnaround, so I wouldn't be too keen to judge him on that if he doesn't perform. But they're clearly starting to find the key to him, and his jumping here was his greatest asset. He clearly stayed well over this trip, and so 3 miles certainly looks like it's in range. Nürburgring, I was slightly disappointed with him. He wasn't able to stay in contention down the hill, but finished to good effect. As a 2-mile hurdle winner, I'd expect him to be able to travel a little bit better. His jumping was pretty sound, but I still think he's a well-handicapped horse going forward over intermediate distances. Answer to Cave, he was well beaten, but I think he's ready for a step up and trip now to 3 miles. He simply couldn't go the gallop coming down the hill, wasn't given a hard time once his chance had gone. And I think if you see him over 3 miles, he's certainly worthy of contention off this current handicap mark. The per temps gave me the bitter-sweet result of the week. It was great to see Doddy the Great win, particularly given the connection he's got with the Doddy Weir Foundation. He's gone up £7 now to a mark of 138. I think that's his ceiling. He's a 10-year-old. There's not going to be an awful lot of improvement forthcoming. More interesting perhaps going forward is the runner-up Jericho de Repene. He's had a really checkered season this year. It all fell apart with his Chase debut. They've had to put him back together. You get the vibe from the yard that he's been a particularly immature and difficult horse to deal with. If he can step forward from this, and the big field handicap experience won't be lost on him, he's up £5 now to a mark of 140, but I wouldn't be at all surprised to see them try chasing with him again next season. The Ryanair gave us, to my mind, the performance of the week, Fat to Far, with a tremendous demonstration of galloping and jumping and a forceful ride, as he was allowed to do, dropping back in trip. There's every chance that he will now step forward and go the Gold Cup route next year, though, of course, Jake McManus has already got the winner, and I know the way you're thinking, but I thought this was a tremendous performance. He got a really nice lead off Ile Francais and Jungle Boogie. They were unable to sustain the gallop coming down the hill. Fat to Far picked it up early enough, I felt, and just careered right away. The further he went, the better he went. It was a really good demonstration of jumping, and Mark Walsh referenced afterwards that his jumping improved for being ridden in a more forceful manner. It'll be interesting to see whether they can try and get that sort of style of ride in over 3 mile trips, but it was a really good performance. Ile Francais, well, he was very disappointing. He clearly didn't cope with this undulating track. That James Reevely didn't feel able to use his jumping, which was his greatest weapon at Kempton, when narrowly beaten in the King George. I think they're going to have a rethink. Aintree is probably going to come too soon now, but I do wonder whether Noel George will see this as a misplaced adventure, and perhaps would have wished that he'd waited and gone to Aintree for a flat track that we know suits Ile Francais so well. Protectorat and JLo, they were well beaten, but I wouldn't give up on them. I think they were not suited by the drying ground at all. And in JLo's case, Venetia Williams' form, just one winner from the last 21 runners. She's starting to lose her form a little bit. I think JLo is interesting going forward next year. The Charlie Hall, the Betfair Chase, something like that, so a little bit softer ground early in the season. I think he's a horse with tremendous potential despite the result here. And then we moved on to the stayers, where I sort of got the right result in that I wanted to be against Tihupu and lay him, but I didn't get the right working out. I thought there were young horses in here and younger legs that would come and better him. As it was a 10-year-old Bob Ollinger under a really good ride by Rachel Blackmore. She kept hold of this horse for as long as she dared, quickened up smartly up the hill, and just had a bit more gears than Tihupu. Tihupu has actually come up in my estimation with this effort. I think he showed his versatility. He coped with livelier ground. He would have been a wide margin winner if Bob Ollinger wasn't in there. But it's a division, the Stayers division, that's ripe for a shake-up. I think the likes of the horse that won the Coral, Jimmy de Soy, something like that, maybe Ballyburn dropping back into this division, certainly will give the main protagonist something to think about, because it's becoming a bit of a stale division. I think the plate handicap chase was probably the most disappointing handicap of the week. There's very few to take out of this of any real interest. Jaguar was a good winner, clearly a very well handicapped horse. He's up £8 now to a mark of 147. I said at the time that I thought John Joe Neal Jr. had given this a really good ride. I've watched it back. I think he had him well positioned and timed his run well, but actually if you watch it back for the race, he found plenty of trouble again for this horse. His jumping was far from fluent, so if he can put in a more fluent round of jumping, mark of 147 might well prove workable. I wonder whether they'll start to work back now from next year's Hennessy. Second year novices have a really good record in this race. He'll certainly look like he'll stay further than this, and that might be where they look to head him. Following on then was the Kim Muir. Again, I don't think we've seen a vintage performance as we did last year. Derek O'Connor very nearly worked the miracle on Johnny Hugh. He got a pretty decent round of jumping out of him, but he made a mess of the last, landed a little bit flat-footed, and then I thought looked a little bit soft in a battle up the hill. I wonder whether headgear will be reached for before too long, maybe cheek pieces to help him concentrate, because I thought he looked like he was keeping a bit for himself up the hill. He certainly looked like the winner throughout that contest, and certainly heading down to the last, but it was a pretty disappointing effort from the back of the last to the line. Eye catchers, I think Grozny perhaps is the most eye-catching one from here. He didn't stay this trip, but he's been dropped £2 now down to a mark of 127. He's a 2 mile 5 furlong hurdle winner off this sort of mark, and I think there's a chase in him, most likely next season, because he's been on the go for some time this season. And then on to the final day, and the first race carried on the theme of the week with big surprises, and Ponyross at 100-1 nabbed Lulamba in the shadows of the post. But it was a pretty good performance by Ponyross, his first ever hurdle start, so you have to give it an automatic upgrade, but I do think Lulamba was slightly mugged. He was in a sustained duel off the home turn with the eventual third East India Dock. Lulamba got the better of that 100 yards from the line and then had no response to Ponyross, who challenged away from him to his left in the shadows of the post. Lulamba, I think they'll look to follow Sergino and go chasing. I'm not sure he's an out-and-out two-miler. He might want a little bit further, but he's clearly a very talented horse indeed to do this on just his second start in the UK. East India Dock, I was slightly disappointed with his effort, and I just wonder whether it's a ride that Sam Twiston-Davies would like to have again. He's a confirmed stayer. He stays 2 miles on the flat, and I just felt Sam got stuck in no man's land. He didn't ride a patient race. He didn't ride an aggressive race. He sort of just sat and nursed him into it going down to the last, and perhaps didn't find as much speed as he'd hoped from the back of the last. But East India Dock didn't jump as well either on this better ground. It might little be that a little bit more cut underfoot would suit him. The big disappointment, I suppose, was Hello Neighbour, who going into this race I fancied didn't have an awful lot left in the locker after his Dublin Racing Festival win, and I think that proved it here. He was pretty weak up the hill of the Protagonist. He's going to want a flatter track, I think, and I think this is his absolute maximum trip. This was 2 mile one. I think 2 miles will suit him better further down the line, and of course he can strengthen up as just a 4-year-old now. The county hurdle, I think, probably produced the handicap performance of the week, with Cargizi winning this. She was a good performer in the juvenile divisions last year. She was second in the Triumph, and she went through this race pretty similarly to last year in the Triumph. She was a little bit keen, but on this occasion there wasn't a match for her to come and pick her up on soft ground up the hill. The livelier ground helped her. She found more than enough to keep pulling away up the hill. She's clearly a graded horse in the making, and was a graded horse in a handicap here. The eye catcher for me was Cracking Rhapsody. He showed that he was able to transfer his form from the Moor Battle hurdle at Calso to a different track. Ran really well here. He's yet to race over further than 2 miles, and given how well he stayed on, having been outpaced, I think going up in trip is something that's worth exploring with him. He stays on a mark of 137. I don't think there's an awful lot of room for manoeuvre over 2 miles, but if he were able to stay a little bit further, that would certainly open up options for him. The Mare's Chase, well, this was just a pretty poor contest, truth told, but Dino Blue was very impressive throughout this. She jumped really well. She stayed strongly. She's clearly the fastest horse in this race, but we'd dearly love to see her in something a little bit more competitive. So I think of all the races of the week, it's the Mare's Chase that needs a real look at. It is not provided the sort of contest that you would associate with the Cheltenham Festival, but she was impressive and can certainly go and mix it against the boys later this season. The Albert Bartlett probably saw Ride of the Week in my book, with Paul Townend winning on Jasmine DeVoe. Not an easy horse to ride. He clearly has his own way of jumping hurdles, but he jumped pretty soundly throughout, bar one mistake at the third last. But Paul Townend kept him wide, gave him plenty of light at his hurdles, came with a strong-looking run, quick and clear up the hill. We know he's got a big engine, and we know he's got a bit of speed because he won the bumper last year. He, I think, looks the most likely horse to go into the Stayers Hurdle division now and shake it up. His jumping is improving with every run. He's clearly got his own way of doing it, but he's figuring things out, and I think he certainly would be towards the top of the of my idea of a winner of next year's Stayers Hurdle. Derry Hassan Paddy, though, for Lucinda Russell, was the eye catcher for me. He ran a tremendous race, pretty light on experience. This was by far and away the liveliest ground he's raced on. He's been kept to heavy and soft ground throughout his career so far, but he led pretty much most of the way. But what I particularly liked was when he got headed at the midway point, he battled back, got to the front, kept his composure, didn't always jump with an awful lot of fluency, but he stuck to his task really well up the hill. I think he's going to make up into a very nice 3-mile chaser next season. And then Wendigo, he was unfortunately get hampered after the second last. He got down, brought down on his knees, picked himself up, rallied into fifth. He wasn't going to be a winner, but he would certainly have finished much closer. His shallow hurdle form behind the new line has worked out really well. He's clearly got a bit of pace. I suspect to see him go over fences next year, where he'll have the advantage of being able to start at shorter trips, work up to his 3-mile trip next year. And I think he could well take high rank, certainly in the UK, as a novice chaser. And then the race that slightly broke my heart last week, the Gold Cup, where Galopin Des Champs was unable to make it 3 Gold Cups in a row. I don't think he had a tremendous amount of excuses. He was hampered by the fall of a Hoysignor at the 15th. He had to go wide and use a little bit of petrol to get back into contention. But I think I know the way you're thinking, was a convincing winner, drawing further and further away towards the line. And you'd have to say, whilst Galopin Des Champs would probably have appreciated softer ground, so too with the winner. He's a little bit younger, perhaps younger legs. And I just wonder as well whether Galopin Des Champs, his 2 big performances in the Savills at Leopardstown and then the Irish Gold Cup, they were monumental performances. Whether they had perhaps just taken the edge off him, that would be the only angle I could conceivably see as to why he perhaps didn't give his running as he has done in the last 2 years. But it could just be that we're seeing a changing of the guard. Banbridge, well, his jumping was pretty moderate. I don't think that helped him, but I think also that you could start to look back now at the King George form and say that maybe we got a bit carried away with what he achieved there. The rest of them, well, they've got no real chance of bridging the gap next year. And I think we're looking towards some novices from left field to bolster this division next year. It might be we head into a slightly weak Gold Cup division for the next couple of years. And then the final race of the week was the Martin Pipe Handicap Hurdle, and Gordon Elliott duly got his winner of the week, and Woodoo was a really impressive winner. She's unbeaten so far over hurdles, and this was an impressive performance. She got to the front plenty soon enough, but she found a really good attitude to draw clear up the hill. I certainly think she's duly going to step up into graded contests, and I think she's a lively contender for the Mayor's Hurdle next year, although of course we know that Lossy Mouse sets a pretty fearsome target. Of those in behind, it was Push the Button in 6th that most impressed me. He was dropping back in trip, having run over 3 miles on his last 2 starts. He stays on a mark of 135. He got outpaced down the hill, but he stayed on really nicely up the hill. I think 3 miles, a mark of 135 looks more than workable, particularly if he's kept to race in the UK, where he's not going to face a pretty fearsome Irish contingent. Toonservator as well would be one I wouldn't give up on. He didn't stay this trip. It looked like he didn't stay at Leopardstown when last trying it, and I think that was confirmed here. But on back into 2-mile handicap hurdles, he's certainly a horse that will be on my radar for next season. So that's the roundup of the Cheltenham Festival, and I think that puts an end to Cheltenham Festival chat for at least 6, 7, potentially 8 months. The next big festival on our cards is the Aintree Festival, and this morning we had the next scratching stage, 11 horses taken out. I thought it was worth just giving you a list of those and one angle that I'm particularly interested in at the moment. So the 11 coming out are Envoy Allen. I know the way you're thinking. He would have been £15 well in, but Gavin Cromwell said they're going to keep him back, look for Punchestown and look for the Gold Cup next year. Gentleman's Game, Monty Star, they both ran well in the Gold Cup, but they're not going to go on to Entry. Neither will the Real Whacker. Galvin has been taken out. He sadly got injured in the cross-country chase. Trelawn has lost all sort of form, ran no race at all in the Ultima, as did Limerick Lace in the Mare's Chase. She's been taken out. So too has Pinkerton, and so too has Jitmaker and Jericho de Repine. The horse that's on my radar now, off a mark of 147, carrying just 10 stone 6, is Vanillier. He will need a couple of horses to come out. 10 stone 7 and above at the moment is the threshold to get you in. He's on 10 stone 6, the same weight that he carried to finish second 2 years ago behind Corrit Rambler. And I think you really need to upgrade his performance in the cross-country chase when Sean Flanagan nearly took the wrong course, lost his position. Vanillier is bouncing back to something like his best form. Gavin Cromwell, we know he's in red-hot form. If he can retain that through to Aintree, around about 16 to 1, I think Vanillier is certainly of real interest. So that's it for what was hopefully a slightly quicker edition of Miller's Movers this week. I'll be back same time next week, where we'll have a slightly more conventional look at the handicap movers and shakers and any action from this weekend.